We're going to kick things off with a couple of speakers from the CDL Toronto Space Stream. And so I'm pleased and honored to introduce our first speaker of the morning, Dr. Nathan Kundtz. Nathan is an associate in our Space Stream. He is currently founder and CEO of a company called Rendered.AI, which is a new company working on physics-based synthetic data generation. Previously, Nathan founded the satellite communications company Kymeta. The technology behind that company's products was Nathan's brainchild as he completed his PhD, making him much like our CDL founders. He led the original tech development of that company as CTO before taking on the role of CEO. And with that, Nathan, I'm pleased to have you here. Over to you.
All right, great. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm excited to share a little bit about space and what's happening in the space markets with you guys. I have exactly 5 minutes to tell you everything I can. So let's get started. Is somebody going to share the presentation, or am I sharing the presentation? There we go. Okay, so one of the trends in space is something that you might be familiar with, but is that the cost of access to space has continued to plummet, and that trend has really just accelerated in last year and this year. And I just threw some numbers up here to give you a sense. We're down to nearly a tenth of what it cost to get to low Earth orbit less than 10 years ago. Most of that at this point is being driven by private US companies, in particular SpaceX, which now sits in a near monopoly position when it comes to private commercial launches. That being said, there's a lot of competition coming in that space. Relativity space has started to grow the number of launches. And so we expect at this point that low cost of access to space is here with us to stay. In terms of the trends that's driving, there's really 4 major markets that drive commercial interest in space access. The first I'll touch on GPS, maybe obvious. Most of that is driven by ground infrastructure. I'm sure everybody probably has a GPS or 5 or 6 GPS devices within arm's reach of them at this time. Television dropping, maybe for obvious reasons, but still a large market. I won't spend too much time on that. The big ones that have been growing and are heavily influenced by this reduction in cost of access to space are Earth observation and communications. And so we see a lot of companies through CDL that are either upstream or downstream companies serving these markets. In the Earth observation space, we're starting to see the data coming off satellites outpacing what we can analyze, and really it's companies that can provide automated analytical tools that are driving growth. But what I want to really spend some time on today is what's going on in the communications sector and why that's something I think really everybody, whether you're interested in space or not, should pay attention to. So can we move forward? So one of the things that's notable when we get into communications is, and in wireless communications in particular, is here on Earth, we generally use low frequency communications. And we do that because we have stuff that we need to get around. We have buildings and trees and other things. And the lower frequencies that we use, the better those waves are, those electromagnetic waves are at getting around that stuff. When we go to space, we're coming down from the sky and there's just less in the way. And so we can use higher frequency communications. And that's important because essentially, and I'm being very reductive here, so for those of you who know better, please, my apologies in advance, but essentially the amount of data that you can push through is proportional to the amount of spectrum that you have access to. And so we get this huge advantage by being able to go to higher frequencies between what we can do with terrestrial mobile and what we can do when we get to higher and higher frequencies. But it doesn't actually stop there because whereas for terrestrial mobile, we tend to speak to one cell tower at a time. In space, we can actually look up and see a number of satellites at a time. So if we can go to the next slide, it's somewhat more accurate if we take that spectrum and we start to say, okay, well, what happens when we multiply those space assets by the number of satellites that we could see in the sky? Now, historically, we have only really been able to communicate with satellites that are in geosynchronous slots. And that means that you see something like this. And this is essentially why we have used those satellites to broadcast television, because it's just so darn cheap to send data across them. But what's really happening now is we're starting to use these not just in geosynchronous slots, but we're starting to use this spectrum across non-geosynchronous slots. And so I think it's worth just taking a gander at what that actually does to this marketplace. So if we can click one more slide forward. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the world of non-geosynchronous spectrum looks like in comparison to the terrestrial mobile industry. That speck in blue is the $1 trillion mobile communications industry. And I suspect that this is a trend that's going to be driving a number of our companies here at CDL and around the world for years to come.